You cannot force a swarm of bees into a box. People think beekeeping is about control, about ruling the hive, and it is the opposite of that. A swarm chooses. When a colony sends out its scouts to find a new home, you cannot capture that decision. You cannot drag 30,000 bees anywhere they haven't agreed to go. All you can do, if you want them, is build a place worth choosing. A clean box in a good spot, out of the wind, near the flowers, dry and safe. You set it up and you leave the lid cracked just so. And then you do the hardest thing in the whole trade. You wait. You let them come on their own, in their own time, when they're ready, or you lose them. That is the only way it has ever worked with bees. And it turns out with the people you love who are trapped somewhere they can't yet leave. I know this because I spent 12 years keeping a place ready for my little sister, not knowing if she would ever fly to it, and being told the whole time by everyone who mattered that I was the one who had done wrong by leaving in the first place. My name is Willa. I'm 47, and I keep bees on a few acres of meadow in the mountains of Idaho, where the wildflowers come up thick in July and the honey tastes like the whole summer at once. I have somewhere around 40 hives now, and they have taught me nearly everything I know that's worth knowing. Most of all this: you can protect a living thing and love it and keep a safe place for it, and still not be able to make it choose freedom until it's ready. I'm going to tell you about my sister and the ant who raised us both and caged one of us, and the day at a bus station when the smallest, most frightened person in my family finally decided to fly. Before I go on, let me ask you something to hold on to. Have you ever been called ungrateful or selfish or a troublemaker, simply for wanting to be free of something that was hurting you? Or worse, for wanting freedom for someone you love who couldn't yet want it for themselves? If you know that particular loneliness, the loneliness of being the only one who could see the bars, then stay with me, because this one is yours. I have to start with how Birdie and I came to belong to our ant, because you can't understand the cage without understanding that it was built at the beginning out of something real. Our parents died when I was 13 and Birdie was 6. A car on an icy road one February night, and in a single evening, 2 little girls had nobody. And our Aunt Loretta, our father's older sister, took us in. She didn't have to. She was unmarried, set in her ways, with a big empty house and a life that suited her, and she opened it up to 2 grieving children, and she raised us. That was a real sacrifice, and I want to be fair to it, because the whole tragedy of what came later is that it grew out of a genuine good thing. Loretta gave up a version of her life for us. She never once let us forget it, but she also never lied about it. She did give it up. The trouble is what she did with the debt, because in my aunt's mind, taking us in didn't make her our mother. It made her our creditor. And a debt like that, the debt of a childhood, is a thing you can never finish paying, which is exactly why it makes such a perfect leash. Everything, forever after, was measured against everything she had given up. Any want of our own, any wish to go somewhere or be someone she hadn't chosen for us, was weighed on that scale and found to be ingratitude. After everything I did for you, that was the sentence that ran underneath our whole childhood like a current, and it was true enough to be unanswerable, and that was its power. Birdie and I took the debt differently, and that difference is the whole story. I was older, I remembered our parents. I remembered a house where love didn't come with an invoice. And some stubborn part of me always knew, even when I couldn't have said it, that gratitude and obedience were not supposed to be the same thing. Birdie was 6 when it all started. She didn't remember another way. Our aunt was the only mother she really knew, and Loretta, whether she meant to or not, went about raising my sister into the exact companion her own lonely life required. She kept Birdie close, kept her soft, kept her convinced she couldn't manage the world without her aunt's guidance. She praised Birdie for staying and worried aloud, constantly, about the dangers out there for a girl who wasn't clever or strong like other people. She built my sister a very small, very safe, very supervised life, and she called it love. And by the time Birdie was grown, she genuinely could not imagine wanting anything else, because wanting had been trained out of her, one careful worry at a time. I remember being the one who mothered Birdie in the early years, before Loretta finished pushing me out of that role too. Birdie had nightmares after our parents died, and she'd pad down the hall to my room, and I'd lift the blanket and she'd crawl in, and I'd tell her stories until she slept. 6 years old and shaking, and I'd promise her I would always be there. I was 13, and I meant it with my whole heart. But Loretta didn't like that Birdie came to me. It undercut something. So she moved Birdie's room next to her own, and she started coming to get her in the night herself. And she'd tell Birdie that her big sister needed her sleep and shouldn't be bothered, that Loretta was the one who would take care of her now. Small things, kind-sounding things. And piece by piece, the person Birdie ran to in the dark stopped being me and started being the very woman who was building the walls. That is how it's done, you understand. Not with cruelty, with 100 tender redirections, each one reasonable, until the child you love has been turned to face the wrong way and calls it home. And I could see it happening. That was my particular curse. I was close enough to Birdie to see the walls going up around her, year by year, and old enough to know they were walls and not shelter. And there was nothing I could do that didn't get turned against me. When I tried to encourage Birdie, to tell her she was capable, to take her out into the world a little, our aunt's radar went off instantly. Because a Birdie who believed she could manage on her own was a threat to the entire arrangement. And Loretta had a genius for making my protectiveness look like its opposite. Willa's filling your head with nonsense. Willa always thought she was better than this family. Willa can't stand that you and I are close. She poisoned the water between my sister and me so slowly and so skillfully that Birdie came to see my attempts to free her as attacks on the aunt who loved her. And I watched my own sister start to flinch from me as if I were the danger. And the whole extended family believed her, because Loretta had spent years building the story before I ever gave her a reason to use it. To the aunts and the cousins and the whole small town, my aunt was a saint, the selfless woman who'd taken in her dead brother's children and given up her own life to do it. That story was airtight, and it was even mostly true. And it meant that anything Loretta said about me landed on ears already prepared to believe it. So when she sighed at family gatherings that she just didn't know what to do about Willa, that Willa was so angry, so ungrateful, so determined to cause trouble after everything, the relatives clucked and shook their heads and looked at me with a pity that had a blade in it. I couldn't win. If I stayed quiet, it confirmed I was sullen. If I defended myself, it confirmed I was combative. If I tried to explain what she was doing to Birdie, it confirmed I was jealous and trying to come between a devoted aunt and the niece who loved her. She had built a room with no door for me too, a role called the Ungrateful one. And every single thing I did just got read as more proof I belonged in it. I left when I was 19. I want to be honest that I left partly to save myself, because staying in that house was slowly killing something in me, and partly because I had finally understood that as long as I was there, I was useful to Loretta as the villain, the ungrateful one, the cautionary tale she could hold up to Birdie to keep her close. My leaving was cast, of course, as the ultimate betrayal, proof of everything Loretta had always said about me. She abandoned this family after everything I sacrificed. And the worst part, the part I carried like a stone for years, was that I did leave Birdie behind. I was 19 and drowning, and I got out, and I could not take my 13-year-old sister with me. And so I left her in that house, alone, with the woman who was quietly folding her smaller and smaller. I have never fully forgiven myself for that, even now. It is the true wound of my life. Not what Loretta did to me, what I couldn't stop her doing to Birdie. Here is what my life became. And I tell you this because it matters to the ending. I drifted west. I worked. I struggled. And eventually, almost by accident, I found bees. A man I worked for kept a few hives, and one day he handed me a frame crawling with them, and I felt, for the first time in my life, completely calm, completely competent, completely myself. I learned the trade. I saved, and I bought my meadow, and I built my apiary, and I built a life that was entirely mine, chosen by me, on land I owned, and it was quiet, and it was free, and there was only one thing wrong with it, which was that my sister wasn't in it. The bees taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way, and one of them cut very close to home. People think a beehive is a little kingdom with the queen as ruler, but that's backwards. And once you understand how it really works, you can't unsee it. The queen doesn't command the colony. The colony keeps the queen, feeds her, tends her, and they keep her only as long as she serves the hive. If a queen fails them, if she stops being good for the colony, the workers will quietly raise a new one and let the old queen go. The power was never really hers. It lived in the 10,000 ordinary bees who agreed, every day, to stay. I used to sit by my hives and think about my aunt, who believed she was the queen of our family, the one everything revolved around. And I'd think, she doesn't understand that her whole reign depends on Birdie agreeing to stay. And I'd wonder if my sister would ever learn what the bees know in their bones, that a colony kept in suffering is allowed, is designed to save itself. The other thing bees taught me was about fear. When you open a hive, you use a little smoke, and the smoke doesn't drug them or hurt them. It just calms their alarm so they don't sting, so you can do the work of caring for them without everyone panicking. And I came to understand that Loretta ruled by the opposite of that. She kept the whole colony of our family in a low, constant alarm, always a danger out there, always a reason to be afraid, always a threat that made staying close feel like safety. A good keeper uses calm to free the bees to live. My aunt used fear to keep them from ever leaving the box. Same hive, opposite hearts. Because I never stopped keeping a place for Birdie. This is the part I need you to understand. From the day I left, I kept the lid cracked. I wrote her letters, most of which I later learned our aunt intercepted. And the few that got through, Birdie answered stiffly, in Loretta's voice, telling me how much she owed our aunt and how she wished I'd appreciate what I'd been given. I sent birthday cards, I called, and either wasn't put through or spoke to a sister who sounded like a hostage reading a statement. And every single time, no matter how it went, I said the same thing at the end. There is a place for you here, whenever you're ready. It never closes. I said it for years into what felt like a void. I built a second little cabin on my land that I told myself was for storage and was really, I knew, for her. I kept a garden going that was too big for one person. I made a place worth choosing, and I left the lid cracked, and I waited. The way you wait for a swarm you have no guarantee will ever come. I kept a photograph of the two of us on my refrigerator the whole time, the only one I had. Birdie, maybe 5, and me, 12. Both of us squinting and laughing at something our mother must have been doing behind the camera. I'd look at it every morning over coffee, at the little girl who used to crawl into my bed, and I'd say out loud to an empty kitchen, "The place is still here." It got so I wasn't sure anymore if I was saying it to her or to myself, if it was a promise or just the thing that kept me getting up. There were birthdays I set 2 cups of coffee out and drank them both. There were Christmases I hung a stocking I never filled. From the outside, it probably looked like a woman who couldn't let go of a ghost, and maybe it was. But I have come to believe that some of the truest love in this world looks, from the outside, exactly like foolishness. A light left on for years in a window nobody's watching. A box kept clean and open for a swarm that may never come. You do it, not because it makes sense, but because the day it stops being foolish, you had better already be standing there, ready. I want to tell you about the winter I almost gave up, because keeping a door open for someone who never walks through it is its own particular kind of grief, and it nearly broke me. Birdie was in her 30s by then, and there had been a moment, a small opening, when she'd taken a part-time job at a library 2 towns over, a tiny taste of a life of her own, and I'd let myself hope so hard it frightened me. And Loretta had shut it down within a month, got herself sick, suddenly, mysteriously, needed Birdie home to care for her, and the job was gone. And my sister went back into the house. And when I called, Birdie told me, in a flat voice, that family comes first, and she was ashamed I'd ever encouraged her to be so selfish. That was the night I sat out by my hives in the cold and thought, I have to stop. I have to close the door and grieve her like something dead, because this hoping is destroying me, and she is never, ever going to come. And I am a fool leaving a light on for a woman who has told me 100 times she doesn't want it. I had the letter half written in my head, the one where I'd finally let her go. And then I thought about the bees. I thought about how a swarm can take years to come to a box, how you can set a box up perfectly and have it sit empty through season after season, and how the ones who give up and take the box down are always, always the ones who lose the swarm, because it comes when it comes, on its own clock, and your only job is to still be there when it does. And I understood something that saved me. Keeping the place open wasn't about Birdie coming. It was about the place being real. If I closed the door to protect myself, then I would have made a liar of every promise I'd ever sent her. And on the day she finally needed somewhere to fly, there would be nothing there. I decided I would keep the lid cracked, not because I expected her, but because a place worth choosing has to actually stay open, or it was never a place at all. I let go of needing her to come. I did not let go of being ready if she did. Those turned out to be the two most important decisions of my life. And they were the same decision. It was 3 more years. Then, last spring, my phone rang at 11 at night, and it was Birdie. And she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. And what had happened was this. There had been a man, a kind, ordinary man, Birdie's age, who came into the library she was, briefly, allowed to volunteer at, and who had, over months, gently fallen for my sister, and she for him. And for the first time in her life, my sister had wanted something so much that she'd found, somewhere down in herself, the nerve to imagine leaving. She had told Loretta she was thinking of marrying him, and our aunt, faced with the final loss of the companion she'd spent 40 years securing, had done the thing she always did, but bigger and uglier than ever before. She had not just gotten sick. She had told this man, privately, that Birdie was unwell, unstable, that she couldn't cope on her own, that he'd be taking on a burden he didn't understand, that the kindest thing he could do was walk away before he ruined both their lives. She had sabotaged the one real chance at freedom my sister had ever reached for. And she had done it wearing the mask of a worried old woman, protecting a man from a mistake. But this time, something was different. This time, Birdie found out the man, to his eternal credit, didn't just vanish. He came to Birdie, bewildered and hurt, and asked her if it was true what her aunt had said, that she couldn't manage, that she was fragile. And in his confused, honest face, my sister saw, finally, all at once, the whole shape of the thing. She saw the cage. She saw that the walls she'd been told were there for her protection had been built to keep her in. She saw 40 years of it in a single, terrible instant, and she called the only person who had ever told her there was another way. She called me. And through the crying, she said the words I had waited 12 years and had given up ever hearing. She said, "Willa, is the place still there? Can I still come?" And I said, the way I'd promised 100 times into the dark, "It never closed. It's ready. It has always been ready. I'll come get you." She wanted to leave the next morning. I told her I'd drive through the night, but she said no. She'd take the bus. She needed to do at least this one part herself. And I understood that. I understood it completely. Because the swarm has to choose. The swarm has to fly on its own, or it isn't free. It's just been moved. So we agreed I'd meet her at the bus station in the town nearest my meadow. And I want to tell you it went smoothly, but of course it didn't. Because a woman like Loretta does not lose 40 years of control without one last fight. Because Loretta found the packed bag. And on the morning my sister was finally leaving, our aunt followed her to that bus station and made her scene in the most public place she could, in front of a waiting room full of strangers. And it was the oldest and most powerful weapon she had. She wept. She clutched at Birdie and she said, "After everything I gave up for you, this is how you repay me. You're going to abandon me just like your sister did. You're going to leave me to die alone. You were always the good one. Don't let Willa turn you cruel." Every note she had played my sister's whole life, played all at once, at full volume, in public, designed to do what it had always done, which was to make Birdie feel like a monster for wanting to exist. I was there. I had gotten there early, and I was standing across that waiting room. And everything in me wanted to storm over and get between them, to fight Loretta the way I'd wanted to for 40 years. But I didn't, and not because I was afraid, because I finally understood, standing there, that if I rescued Birdie in that moment, if I fought her battle for her, then she would leave that station as my sister instead of as her own woman, carried out of one person's control and into another's shelter. And she would never once, in her whole life, know that she could have done it herself. The swarm has to fly on its own. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than leaving, harder than the 12 years of waiting. I stood still, and I let my little sister face the dragon alone, and I trusted the place I had built to be worth choosing. The seconds it took felt like the longest of my life. I stood there with my hands at my sides, aching to move, watching Loretta pour 40 years of practiced grief over my sister, and I could see Birdie's shoulders start to curve inward the way they always had, the old shape, the folding. For one terrible moment, I was sure she'd cave, that she'd set the bag down and take her aunt's arm and go home, and that this would be the last time, that if she went back now, she'd never reach for the door again, and I would have to close it at last. I almost broke my own rule. I almost ran to her, and then I saw something move across my sister's face that I had never seen there before, something that was not fear, and she stopped folding. And my sister, my soft, folded, frightened little sister, who had never once in 40 years said no to that woman, straightened up. I watched it happen across that room. I watched Birdie take her aunt's hands off of her, gently, not cruelly, and set them down. And she said, in a voice I had never heard from her, a voice that shook but did not stop, "Aunt Loretta, you did give up a lot for us. That was real, and I'll be grateful for it my whole life. But you have spent 40 years making me pay for it by staying small, and I am not going to do that anymore. I am not abandoning you. I am just finally going to go live." And then she picked up her own bag with her own hand, and she walked across that waiting room to me, and she did not look back. And behind her, our aunt stood in the middle of all those strangers with her arms still out, holding nothing. And for the first time in either of our lives, no one in the room moved to comfort her. The scene had always worked before, because there was always an audience trained to rush in. There, among strangers who owed her nothing and saw only an old woman guilt-tripping a grown daughter, it just hung in the air, embarrassing and small, and finally, completely powerless. Here is what it cost Loretta, and it is the coldest, quietest price I know of. She did not go to jail. There is no law against building a cage out of gratitude. What she lost was the only thing she had ever truly been building, which was Birdie's belonging to her. For 40 years, my aunt had a companion, a witness, a devoted good daughter whose smallness confirmed her own importance, and whose need for her was the proof that all her sacrifice had meant something. That was her entire identity, the martyr with the daughter who owed her everything. And in one morning at a bus station, that daughter set her hands down and walked away, and Loretta was left as what she had, underneath, always been. A woman alone in a big empty house who had confused being needed with being loved, and who had held on so hard to the 2 children she took in that she had crushed the life out of one relationship and driven the other across the country. She had spent her whole life terrified of being left alone, and she had guaranteed it, one worried, controlling, self-sacrificing day at a time. The family that had always taken her side, the aunts and cousins who'd nodded along about ungrateful Willa, slowly came to understand what had really happened. Because Birdie, once she was free, was not a fragile, incompetent woman at all, and her obvious blooming was its own testimony. You cannot keep calling someone incapable while they build a happy, capable life in front of everyone. The story broke the way all such stories break, against the plain evidence of a person set free. I saw the exact moment the family turned. At a cousin's wedding that first summer, Birdie walked in on her husband's arm, easy and glowing, and got into a long, laughing conversation with the very aunts who'd spent years pitying poor, fragile Birdie and shaking their heads about ungrateful Willa. And I watched those women look at my sister, really look, and I watched the arithmetic happen behind their eyes, the slow understanding that the incapable girl they'd been told about had never existed, and that if that was a lie, then maybe the other lie, the one about me, had been too. Nobody apologized. Families like mine don't. But one of them found me by the punch bowl later and said, a little awkwardly, that Birdie seemed to be doing wonderfully, and that she supposed Birdie had needed a push, and that maybe some of us had been too hard on the one who gave it. That was as close to being cleared as I was ever going to get, and I found, to my surprise, that it was enough, because I had stopped needing their verdict a long time ago. Out by my hives, in all those quiet seasons of learning that the truth doesn't require an audience to be true. And Loretta realized it. That's the part I didn't expect and can't fully enjoy. Some months later, she wrote Birdie a letter, and it was not really an apology. Loretta was never going to manage a true apology. But there was a line in it where she wrote that she supposed she had loved us the only way she knew how, which was to hold on, and that she saw now that holding on and loving were not the same thing, and that she was sorry to have learned it so late and so alone. My sister cried over that letter. So did I, because it was true, and because it was too late, and because a person can spend an entire life doing damage in the sincere belief that they are giving love, and only understand the difference when the room is finally, permanently empty. Birdie lives near me now. She's in that second cabin I always pretended was for storage, though she's talking about a place of her own, and I encourage it because the whole point was never to move her from one keeper to another. She got the bees in her too, a little. She helps me in the meadow in the summer, and she's steady with them, calm. And it turns out my sister is not fragile and never was. She was just a swarm that had been kept in a dark box so long she'd forgotten she had wings. She married her library man last fall. I stood up for her, and she is, at 40, becoming a person for the first time. And watching it is the great joy of my life, the thing I kept the lid cracked 12 long years to see. The change in her still catches me off guard some mornings. She'll come across the meadow with the coffee, humming, in no hurry, and I'll remember the flat, frightened voice on the phone all those years. The woman who apologized for wanting a library job, and I can hardly connect them. She laughs now, a real laugh, loud and unguarded. The laugh I think she must have had at 6 before it got trained out of her. She argues with me, which I love, because a person who can disagree with you is a person who knows she's allowed to exist. Last summer, we were working a hive together and a swarm went up. Thousands of bees lifting into the air in that great spiraling cloud that used to frighten her. And instead of shrinking back, she stood there with her face turned up watching them. And she said, quietly, "They're not running away, are they? They're looking for a better home." And I said, "That's exactly what they're doing." And she smiled at the sky, and I knew she wasn't talking about the bees. And neither was I. So if you are out there tonight, and you have been made to feel like a traitor for wanting to be free, or like a troublemaker for seeing a cage that everyone else calls love, let me tell you what the bees taught me across all those empty seasons. You cannot force the ones you love toward freedom. You cannot argue them out of a cage they've been taught to call home. And you cannot carry them out on your own back. Because a person moved is not a person freed. All you can do is refuse to call the cage by the pretty name they gave it, and build a real place worth choosing, and keep the lid cracked, and stay alive and ready, however long it takes, so that on the day they finally find their wings, there is somewhere true to fly to. It may take years, it may take 12. Keep the place open anyway, not because they are certain to come, because a colony kept in suffering will, in the end, raise itself a new queen, and a heart kept too long in a dark box will, one ordinary morning, remember, it was always meant to fly, and when it does, it should not have to fly into nothing. Be the meadow, leave the lid cracked, and wait.